information for it. And I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, lost contact he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, when I went into this and would, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. My opinion then and my opinion now is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Familiar with the 2000?
Well, maybe you can assess that 2000 Mules, and people are talking about that.
Well, just in a nutshell, I just think that the GBI was unimpressed with it, and I was similarly unimpressed with it because I think I was holding my fire on that to see what the photographic evidence was, because I thought, well, hell, if they have a lot of photographs of the same person dumping a lot of ballots in different boxes, that's hard to explain. So I wanted to see what the photographic evidence was, but the cell phone data is singularly unimpressive. It basically, if you take 2 million cell phones and figure out where they are physically in a big city like Atlanta or wherever, just by definition, you're going to find many hundreds of them have passed by and spent time in the vicinity of these boxes. And the premise that, if you go by a box, 5 boxes or whatever it was, that's a mule is just indefensible. It by definition, you're going to have hundreds of this. I saw one contractor said, we figured out that our truck alone would account for 6 cell phone signals. This was some kind of contractor, and our route would take us by these things on a regular basis. So but then when the movie came out, I think the photographic evidence in it was completely there was a little bit of it, but it was lacking. It didn't establish widespread illegal harvesting. The other thing is people don't understand is that it's not clear that even if you can show harvesting, that changes the results of the election. The courts are not going to throw out votes and then figure out what votes were harvested and throw them out. It's still the burden on the challenging party to show that illegal votes were cast. Votes were the result of undue influence or bribes, or there was really, the person was non-compos mentis. But absent that evidence, I just didn't see courts throwing out votes anyway. I felt that before the election, it was possible to talk sense to the president. And while you sometimes had to engage in a big wrestling match with him, that it was possible to keep things on track. But I felt that after the election, he didn't seem to be listening, and I didn't think it was, that I was inclined not to stay around if he wasn't listening to advice from me or his other cabinet secretaries.
So on December 14th, Barr quit. Now, the Attorney General wasn't the only person who told the president that his claims were false. Other officials and close advisors told him the same thing.
Rather than try to address a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let me just say there were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, people have already looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information, that that's not correct. It's been demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view. It's been debunked.
A month and a half or so after the election day, and at that meeting, various allegations of fraud were discussed. And, Eric and Pat didn't, told the group, the president included, that, none of those allegations had been substantiated to the point where they could be the basis for any litigation challenge to the election.
President Trump's own vice president and his top advisors also knew that there wasn't evidence to support the claims that the president was making.
Anyone else other than Mr. Meadows who asked you about the status outside of your legal group, Mr. Morgan and the others you mentioned? Anyone else who asked you the status of what you were finding in your assessment of it?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Peter Navarro.
When did you talk to Mr. Navarro?
Mid-November.
Around the same time as Mr. Meadows?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that conversation.
I recall him asking me questions about Dominion and maybe some other categories of allegations of voter fraud. And I remember telling him that I didn't believe the Dominion allegations because I thought the hand recount in Georgia would resolve any issues with the technology problem and with Dominion or Dominion flipping votes. And I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure. And I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state working with Chris Krebs against the president. And I never took another phone call from Mr. Navarro.
Anyone else besides Mr. Meadows, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Hirschman that you had discussions with inquiring about what you were finding in your review of the allegations that were pouring in?
I believe I had about a 15-second conversation with the vice president about it as well.
When was that?
During one of the visits to the White House. I don't know which one. I think it was the first one in November. I had met him briefly at the campaign, and he remembered me and saw me. And he asked what I was doing on the campaign, and I told him that, we were looking into some of the issues related to voter fraud. And he asked me, I don't remember his exact words, but he asked me if we were finding anything. And I said that I didn't believe we were finding it, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter the results of the election. And he thanked me. That was our interaction.
At a later hearing, you'll hear live testimony from the former acting Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Rich Donahue. But now I'd like to play a portion of his testimony.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked at Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false. And then I went into, for instance, this thing from Michigan, this report about 68% error rate. Reality is it was only 0.0063% error rate, less than 1 in 15,000. So the president accepted that. He said, okay, fine, but what about the others? And again, this gets back to the point that there were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation. So then I talked about a little bit about the Pennsylvania truck driver. This is another allegation that had come up. And the name was by a truck driver who believed, perhaps honestly, that he had transported an entire tractor-trailer truck full of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania. And this was, again, out there in the public and discussed. And I essentially said, look, we looked at that allegation. We looked at both ends, both the people who load the truck and the people who unload the truck. And that allegation was not supported by the evidence. Again, he said, okay. And then he said, no, I didn't mention that one. What about the others? And I said, okay, well, with regard to Georgia, we looked at the tape, we interviewed the witnesses. There is no suitcase. The president kept fixating on this suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility. There's nothing suspicious about that at all. I told them that there was no multiple scanning of the ballots. One part of that allegation was that they were taking one ballot and scanning it through 3 or 4 or 5 times to rack up votes, presumably for Vice President Biden. I told them that the video did not support that. Then he went off on double voting. The top of the next page, he said, dead people are voting. Indians are getting paid to vote. He meant people on Native American reservations. He said there's lots of fraud going on here. Told him flat out that much of the information he's getting is false and or just not supported by the evidence. We look at the allegations, but they don't pan out.
Mr. Barr and his advisors were not the only ones who determined that the president's allegations regarding Dominion voting machines were false. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing reports issued by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, that addressed and rejected the claims of manipulation of voting machines in the 2020 election.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a report prepared by the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that disproved claims of election fraud in Michigan, as well as a statement by 59 of the country's leading election security scientists, noting the absence of any credible evidence that the 2020 election had been altered through technical compromise, and 5 other reports from organizations and individuals confirming there was no widespread fraud in the 2020 election or describing the spread of the former president's lies.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the order of the committee for today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
And some stunning testimony on day 2 of these first public hearings by the committee investigating the insurrection on January 6th. The chairman saying that President Trump was involved in a scheme unprecedented in American politics. We heard them try and tell the narrative, show the evidence about how Donald Trump lost the election, knew he lost the election, and in the chairman's words, as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack against democracy. Let's go through and analyze all that we have heard and what is new from these hearings. Let's bring in our chief election and campaign correspondent, Robert Costa, who's on Capitol Hill. Bob, let's start first with President Trump's own campaign manager, Bill Stepien, who was unable to appear today because his wife is in labor. But we did hear from his deposition in which he told the president on multiple occasions what he called the truth. Break it down for us, Bob.
Nora, good to be with you. Steppian's testimony brought us back to a critical crossroads in the days after the 2020 election, in particular, November 7th, 2020. As Bob Woodward and I reported in our book, this was when Steppian and others went to Trump and essentially said, "It's over, sir. The numbers aren't there." But Trump refused to concede then, and he started to move. It was a decision to go toward Rudy Giuliani, and that's what the committee detailed today in this opening phase.
And then they went on to detail how an inebriated, in the words of Liz Cheney, Rudy Giuliani was with the president trying to tell him to do something differently.
That's exactly right. It was detailed how Jason Miller, a former campaign advisor to Donald Trump, said that he witnessed Giuliani being inebriated up in the residence in the hours after votes were being counted in early November. And Giuliani and others were encouraging Trump to go out there and declare victory, even though the numbers did not back that up.
Bob Costa, thank you. Let's bring it back here in studio. And Major, in addition to Bill Steppian, a long-trusted conservative Republican political operative telling the president that, what we heard today was from a bunch of other Republicans, including the Attorney General of the United States, lawyers in the White House and in the campaign, telling the president the evidence that you're hearing is not correct. We can't find any fraud.
So this answers a central question that former President Trump has relied on repeatedly, noxiously, inaccurately, which is no one looked into this. False, false, false. Your government looked into it. The people you put in places of authority looked into it. The people you surrounded yourself with voluntarily looked into this, point by point, allegation by allegation, and then came back to you and said, Mr. President, that allegation is false. It doesn't stand up. It's not supportable. We don't have the evidence for it. And he kept looking again and again and again. And this is one of the things that's most injurious about what's happened to our country. The former President of the United States, and while he was in the presidency, continued to look and look and look and look, never accepting the actual result of the will of the people. He constantly looked for a way to justify overturning that result. And when he couldn't do it through the procedures of his government, he sought to do it through the creation of an incentivized, impassioned mob to come to Congress and try to change the result.
Nicole, you're up there on Capitol Hill every day. We also heard from Zoe Lofgren, of course, to say that the big lie was also a big ripoff, that the president's political team benefited financially by continuing to propagate this lie and raising hundreds of millions of dollars that then resulted in the January 6th insurrection.
Well, exactly. I mean, that the president and his team were fundraising off of this, and that ultimately by propagating these lies, that enabled his supporters to come to the Capitol that day, in essence, in the words of the committee, lighting the fuse that resulted in the insurrection that we saw. But I also just wanted to talk about, to Major's point, just this daylight that we saw between the former president and his campaign team, specifically on Election Day. You heard Bill Steppian, who, even though he wasn't there in person, really had some very weighty testimony through those depositions, but, basically saying that he felt that the president shouldn't go out there and declare victory. It was, they couldn't make the call yet to just talk about how we've done a good job thus far, and let's wait and see how the numbers bear out. And as somebody who covered President Biden that day, or then candidate Biden, it was very interesting because that night President Biden said that it is not my place to declare who won. And yet the president, that night, President Trump, came out saying, frankly, we won that night. So even then you saw those divergent paths that started well before the election but carried out on that election night and well beyond.
And of course, Scott McFarland also up on Capitol Hill for us, and so many details of this investigation by the January 6th committee. What did you learn today?
The committee's making the case that the election lies sparked the fire January 6th, but the lies same day put gasoline on the fire. It actually began with Rudy Giuliani at the White House ellipse. In the same breath in which he said trial by combat, he was questioning the integrity of the election, but more so, President Trump with his social media posts during that day. 2:24 p.m. It's this tweet directed about Mike Pence, saying Mike Pence didn't have courage, questioning and saying there was fraud and inaccuracies in the election. He sent that tweet. Watch the times here. 2:24 p.m. Let me take you inside the Capitol, show you what 2:24 p.m. was. I'll lift the dome, go to the second floor. Here's Mike Pence being evacuated for his safety from the Senate chamber. What time is this? 2:25 p.m. 1 minute after President Trump's tweet. What's more, Nora? About 20 minutes later, here's the U.S. House chamber. 20 minutes after the tweet about the election lie. It fueled the riot after the riot had begun.
Fascinating, Scott. Thank you. And John, we heard one of the White House counsel say that some of the claims that were being made about the Dominion voting systems were, in his words, nuts. Then we heard the Attorney General using words like BS, disturbing, idiotic, a grave disservice to our country.
And as we've been talking about, Eric Hirschman, the White House counsel, he was President Trump's defender in the first impeachment on Ukraine. In other words, he's on Team Trump. All of these people, campaign manager, White House lawyer, Attorney General, Department of Justice, Pence team, all of them are on Team Trump. They have every inclination to tell him what he wants to hear. They've spent a lot of time doing that. And in this instance, they said no. What today is about is building a tower of all the people who were telling the president, including the lawyers, including the judges, including all the states that did the audits. And that tower creates a case. And the case is no reasonable person would believe this was true, and therefore you must conclude the president knew it was a lie and launched all of this lie, launched all the mayhem as a result of this lie. And we should step back one moment and look at the claim the president was making. A president cannot make a more volatile claim than this, or it's among the top volatile claims a president can make, that an election was stolen. This isn't a garden variety political spat. This is a president claiming that an election was stolen, and because of the size of that tower, he was claiming an election was stolen based on total fiction.
And what the committee says, it was his effort to cling to power. But I was struck that the former Attorney General used the words like crazy. The former impeachment lawyer who was then in the White House, nuts. The suggestion that the president had become detached from reality.
There are two. You can either decide the tower is really high and decide it's a lie, or you can just not recognize it at all. It's either you're spreading a lie or you're delusional.
And the importance for all of this, Nora, and the committee's going through this process leaning on trusted Trump advisors to tell this message for a very specific reason. There's an old saying in politics, it's easier to fool someone than to persuade them that they've been fooled. And there's a certain percentage of our country who still wants to believe there was something wrong with this election. They're not sure what it was because all the various conspiracy theories have come and gone, but they still are upset with it. And this is a way of saying to them through trusted Trump voices, it didn't happen the way you're fearful. Rely on the system. He was wrong. Believe in what actually happened.
We also want to bring in someone who was just mentioned in the hearing, our now CBS News cybersecurity expert and analyst, Chris Krebs. And Krebs served as the director of the Homeland Security Department's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a mouthful, but Chris, what that agency does is incredibly important. Describe what the report is that you delivered and what it specifically rebutted.
Well, throughout the 2020 election, we were working closely with state and local officials, including Al Schmidt, who you'll see in the next panel, to help them secure their systems and understand kind of the day-to-day threats they were experiencing. But November 12th, there was a report and a statement issued by what's known as the Executive Committee of the Sector Coordinating Council and the Government Coordinating Council, which is basically the public-private partnership of all the entities involved in administering election, whether the state, local, federal, or private sector space. And it was ultimately a statement that said there has been no observed interference in the election. We believe that it was a safe and secure election. And that statement went out on November 12th. And obviously it was not received well in the White House. And I would say the timing to accompany that of the 59 election security experts that was just referenced and entered into the record, that similarly said that any of the claims that we've heard from Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, or anything like that were technically incoherent and effectively nonsense. So, look, they knew that they lost, and they decided to proceed with these claims of election interference anyway. And I seems to me they're establishing a broader set of perhaps a fraud committed upon the American people.
Chris Krebs, thank you for being here. Let's bring in Bob Costa one more time as we are getting ready to hear the second panel today. What does this mean for the future of the Republican Party, where President Trump is still the most popular member and has been quite influential in campaigns?
In brief, Nora, it's important to note that what we're hearing today, the truth about what happened, people talking under oath, is only happening because subpoenas were issued by this committee. It underscores why the committee exists, why its work is important in bringing out that truth. So many people in the Republican Party today do not want to speak out against former President Donald Trump because they believe he still has political capital and still might run in 2024.
Let's bring in Nancy Cordes, who is at the White House. And Nancy, so much of this information is new for many of these officials who have been subpoenaed. Did they speak out publicly at the time, or are we only learning this as a result of the committee's work?
Nora, not only did many of them not speak out at the time, but when they did, they often backed up the president's claims. That's what's so jarring today, listening to their depositions. And let's just start with the former Attorney General, Bill Barr. You know, he now says that he told the president in the starkest terms that these fraud theories were bogus and silly and based on complete misinformation. Well, at the time, in the months leading up to the election, he was saying something very different. The Attorney General was going out there and saying that mail-in ballot fraud could be widespread, and that was something that he was very concerned about, even though that had never proven to be the case. And in fact, Nora, when he issued his resignation letter publicly about 6 weeks after the November election, listen to his first sentence in that resignation letter to the president. I appreciate the opportunity to update you on vote fraud allegations and how those allegations will continue to be pursued. Very different from what we're hearing him say today, Nora.
So you found it a bit of revisionist history by the former Attorney General, Nancy.
Absolutely. Either that, Nora, or yes, he was saying one thing to the president in private. He was saying that these claims were BS. But as the Attorney General of the country, he did not bother or wasn't willing to come out there and say publicly that these allegations were baseless.
Nancy Cordes at the White House about to get started, but this idea that was really propagated that the Dominion voting machines were somehow flipping votes was really undermining democracy and people's trust in elections.
It can't happen, and it was one thing that the former president clung to long after it was disproven internally and externally.
Let's listen in to Chairman Thompson.
Georgia. Mr. Smith is a former city commissioner for the city of Philadelphia, where he served for more than 10 years. Mr. Ginsburg is one of the leading election law attorneys in the country and has represented Republican presidential candidates in election litigation dating back to 2000, where he represented George W. Bush in the Bush v. Gore litigation. I will now swear in our witnesses. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the break, I think you all heard Mr. Barr and Mr. Donahue talk about the false claims that Mr. Trump and his supporters made about suitcases of fake ballots in Georgia. We have a witness here today who thoroughly investigated that issue. Mr. Pack, I want to thank you for appearing before us today. You were appointed by President Trump to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and you served from 2017 until January of 2021. You were the lead federal prosecutor there and worked for the Department of Justice under then Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, were you ever asked by Attorney General Barr to to investigate claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election? And if so, what were those claims?
Thank you, Congressman Loughran. Thank you for the question. Approximately December 4th, I believe, of 2020, Attorney General Barr and I had a conversation about an unrelated case to the case. Mr. Barr had asked me if I had seen a certain videotape that was being reported in the news where Mr. Giuliani, in a Senate subcommittee hearing that was held the day before, May 3rd, showed a videotape of a purportedly a security tape at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, which is also in Fulton County, in the city of Atlanta. Yes. At the time, Mr. Barr asked me that he had made a public statement that he had not seen any widespread election fraud that would question the outcome of the election. And because of the videotape and the serious allegation that Mr. Giuliani was making with respect to the suitcase full of ballots purported in the video, he asked me to find out what I could about it, because he had envisioned that in some days after our call that he was going to go to the White House for a meeting, and then that issue might come up. He asked me to make it a priority to get to the bottom of, to try to substantiate the allegation made by Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you. I understand the Georgia Secretary of State's office investigated those State Farm Arena allegations and didn't find any evidence of fraud. What did you find when your office conducted its own investigation?
We found that the suitcase full of ballots, the alleged black suitcase that was being seen pulled from under the table, was actually an official lockbox where ballots were kept safe. We found out that there was a mistake in terms of a misunderstanding that they were done counting ballots or tallying ballots for the night, and the partisan watchers that was assigned by each of the respective parties were announced to send home. Well, once they realized the mistake, someone from the Secretary of State's office had indicated that, no, we're not done for the night. You need to go ahead and continue counting. So once they packed up the lockbox full of ballots, they brought back the official ballot box again and continued to tally the ballots from the lockbox. Unfortunately, during the Senate hearing, Mr. Giuliani only played a clip that showed them pulling out the official ballot box from under the table and referring to that as a smoking gun of a fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because of the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
Thank you very much. I'd like to play again a testimony from Mr. Donahue, who appeared before the committee before today.
Mr. Donahue, we talked at some length about whether or not the White House or the president was informed about the Antrim report. On the result of the investigations, the interviews that have gone on Fulton County, how would those results have been communicated to the White House, to the president?
I don't know how they were initially communicated. I do know that they came up in subsequent conversations with the president, and Dag Rose and I essentially told him we looked into that, and it's just not true.
Okay, so he was informed.
I told the president myself that several times in several conversations, that these allegations about ballots being smuggled in a suitcase and run through the machine several times, it was not true. That we looked at the video, we interviewed the witnesses, it was not true.
Mr. Pack, after you left the U.S. Attorney's Office on January 4th, 2021, did the next U.S. Attorney there, I think Mr. Trump's personal pick, Bobby Christine, did he investigate any remaining claims of fraud? And if so, did he find any evidence that supported the president's claims of voter fraud?
It is my understanding that Mr. Christine continued any investigations that were pending at the time of my departure, but he was unable to find any evidence of fraud that affected the outcome of the election.
So after investigating the president's and Mr. Giuliani's claims about voter fraud in Georgia, is it your view today that there was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to undermine confidence in the outcome of the election in Georgia?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Pack. And I want to thank you also for the service that you've given to our country. We appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn to President's false allegations about election integrity in Philadelphia. The Attorney General discussed these allegations at some length.
You know, the idea, the president has repeatedly suggested that there was some kind of outpouring of unexpected votes in inner city areas like Philadelphia as recently as January 13th when he walked off the NPR set. He was asked by the interviewer, what's your evidence of fraud? And he said more people voted in Philadelphia than there were voters. And that was absolute rubbish. The turnout in Philadelphia was in line with the state's turnout. And in fact, it was not as impressive as many suburban counties. And there was nothing strange about the Philadelphia turnout. It wasn't like there was all these unexpected votes that came out in Philadelphia. So, I think once you actually look at the votes and then there's an obvious explanation. For example, in Pennsylvania, Trump ran weaker than the Republican ticket generally. He ran weaker than two of the state candidates. He ran weaker than the congressional delegation running for federal Congress, and he ran weaker than the Republican, I think. I haven't looked at this recently, but he generally was a weak element on the Republican ticket, so that does not suggest that the election was stolen by fraud.
How about Pennsylvania and Bill McSwain? We were talking to the U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia about an alleged discrepancy between the number of absentee ballots issued and the number of ballots cast.
Right. So that was one of the big ones for a period of time. I think that was raised at Gettysburg by Giuliani or something like that, but it kept on being repeated, and I found it annoying because it didn't seem that it was right. So I called McSwain, and he got back to me. He said, no, the problem is that Mastriano threw out this number, and what he did was he mixed apples and oranges. He took the number of applications for the Republican primary and he compared it to the number of absentee votes cast in the general election. But once you actually go and look and compare apples to apples, there's no discrepancy at all. And that's one of the I think at some point I covered that with the president.
We have another witness here today who has detailed knowledge about the election process in Philadelphia. Mr. Schmidt, at the time of the 2020 presidential election, you were serving as the only Republican member of Philadelphia's three-member city commission, which is responsible for overseeing elections throughout the city. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressperson.
So President Trump made numerous claims regarding fraudulent voting practices in Philadelphia, including the claim that dead people were voting. In fact, Mr. Giuliani told Pennsylvania state legislators that 8,000 dead people voted in Pennsylvania. You investigated those claims of voter fraud. Can you tell us what you found?
Not only was there not evidence of 8,000 dead voters voting in Pennsylvania, there wasn't evidence of 8. We took seriously every case that was referred to us, no matter how fantastical, no matter how absurd, and took every one of those seriously, including these.
As it turns out, even Mr. Trump's campaign lawyers knew that the dead voter claims weren't valid.
I guess the crooks in Philadelphia are disappointed in this. They only submitted 8,021 ballots from dead people, mail-in ballots for dead people. Probably easier for dead people to submit mail-in ballots than it is to vote in person.
Rudy was, at this stage of his life, and the same ability to manage things at this level or not. And obviously, I think Bernie Kerik publicly said it. They never proved the allegations that they were making, and they were trying to develop.
Mr. Schmidt, on November 11th, 2020, President Trump tweeted about you, saying, and here's a quote, "A guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican, or rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption, dishonesty. We win." As a result of that tweet and the CNN interview you gave where you stated the dead voter claims in Pennsylvania were false, you and your staff were subjected to disturbing threats. Can you tell us about that?
The threats prior to that tweet, and on some level it feels almost silly to talk about a tweet, but we can really see the impact that they have, because prior to that, the threats were pretty general in nature. Corrupt election officials in Philadelphia are going to get what's coming to them. You're what the Second Amendment is for. You're walking into the lion's den, all sorts of things like that. After the president tweeted at me by name, calling me out the way that he did, the threats became much more specific, much more graphic, and included not just me by name, but included members of my family by name, their ages, our address, pictures of our home, just every bit of detail that you could imagine. That was what changed with that tweet.
Behind me are redacted threats that you received, that you provided to the committee. Now, we redacted portions of the text to protect your family. Mr. Schmidt, I think I speak for all of my colleagues when I say we are deeply sorry for what you and your loved ones have been through. And I also want to thank you for your service to your country and for standing up for the rule of law. I want to thank both Mr. Pack and Mr. Schmidt for their service, their testimony, and for standing up for the rule of law. Now I'd like to turn to another subject. The courts in our country provide a legitimate venue for campaigns to challenge what they view as irregular election practices. Now, courts have the final say on how the law applies to those challenges. We have a renowned legal expert here to address the Trump campaign's activities in court. Mr. Ginsburg, you spent your entire career representing Republicans in election-related litigation. You served as the National Counsel on Republican presidential campaigns in 2000, in 2004, and in 2012. You played a key role in the 2000 Florida recount that led to the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore. You served as the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. I think it's fair to say you're the most prominent Republican lawyer who's litigated in the election field. Now, you've analyzed the Trump campaign's litigation pretty carefully. What's the normal process for post-election litigation? How is the Trump campaigns different from the kinds of post-election litigation you've been involved in and know about?
In the normal course of things, any campaign on the night of the election and the days after will do a couple of different things. One is that they'll analyze precinct results to look for abnormalities in the results, and they'll send people to those precincts to ask more questions. Secondly, all campaigns will have poll watchers and poll workers and observers in the polling place. And so campaigns will talk to those people if they saw any irregularities that could cause problems in the election. Now, the Trump campaign talked pre-election about having 50,000 poll workers. So presumably they did have eyes on the ground in all these places. And so in the normal course of things, a campaign will analyze the reports that come in. Trump campaign had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close. In 2000, that was 537 and close. In this election, the most narrow margin was 10,000 and something in Arizona, and you just don't make up those sorts of numbers in recounts. And when the claims of fraud and irregularities were made, you've heard very compelling testimony from Mr. Stepien, from Matt Morgan, from Alex Cannon about those claims and how they didn't believe them. And so that put the Trump campaign on sort of a process of bringing cases without the actual evidence that you have to have in which the process is designed to bring out.
So are you aware of any instance in which a court found the Trump campaign's fraud claims to be credible?
No, there was never that instance. In all the cases that were brought, and I've looked at the more than 60 that include more than 180 counts. And no, the simple fact is that the Trump campaign did not make its case.
The Select Committee has identified 62 post-election lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and his allies between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. Those cases resulted in 61 losses and only a single victory, which actually didn't affect the outcome for either candidate. Despite those 61 losses, President Trump and his allies claim that the courts refused to hear them out, and as a result, they never had their day in court. Mr. Ginsburg, what do you say about the claims that Mr. Trump wasn't given an opportunity to provide the evidence they had of voter fraud? Did they have their day in court?
They did have their day in court. About half of those cases that you mentioned were dismissed at the procedural stage for a lack of standing. The proper people didn't bring the case, or there wasn't sufficient evidence and it got dismissed on a motion to dismiss. But in the other, there was discussion of the merits that was contained in the complaints. And in no instance did a court find that the charges of fraud were real. And it's also worth noting that even if the Trump campaign complained that it did not have its day in court, there have been post-election reviews in each of the 6 battleground states that could have made a difference. And those ranged from the somewhat farcical Cyber Ninjas case in Arizona to the Michigan Senate report that was mentioned earlier, the hand recount in Georgia that Mr. Pack addressed. And in each one of those instances, there was no credible evidence of fraud produced by the Trump campaign or his supporters.
Thank you. As Mr. Ginsburg has explained, there are no cases where the Trump campaign was able to convince a court that there was widespread fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election. Over and over, judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans alike directly refuted this false narrative. They called out the Trump campaign's lack of evidence for its claims. And the judges did that even in cases where they could have simply thrown out the lawsuit without writing a word. You can see behind me a few excerpts from the decisions in these 62 cases. The Trump campaign's lack of evidence was criticized by judges across the political spectrum. In Pennsylvania, a Trump-appointed judge concluded, quote, "Charges require specific allegations and proof. We have neither here." Another Trump-appointed judge warned that if cases like these succeeded, quote, "Any disappointed loser in a presidential election able to hire a team of clever lawyers could flag claim deviations from election results and cast doubt on election results." The list goes on and on. Allegations are called, quote, an amalgamation of theories, conjecture, and speculation. In another, strained legal arguments without merit, unsupported by evidence, derived from wholly unreliable sources, a fundamental and obvious misreading of the Constitution. The rejection of President Trump's litigation efforts was overwhelming. 22 federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, including 10 appointed by President Trump himself, and at least 24 elected or appointed Republican state judges dismissed the president's claims. At least 11 lawyers have been referred for disciplinary proceedings due to bad faith and baseless efforts to undermine the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Rudy Giuliani had his license to practice law suspended in New York. And just this week, a newly filed complaint will potentially make his suspension from practicing law in D.C. permanent. And as we've just heard from perhaps the most preeminent Republican election lawyer in recent history, the Trump campaign's unprecedented effort to overturn its election laws in court was a deeply damaging abuse of the judicial process. As stated by U.S. District Court Judge David Carter, this was, quote, a coup in search of a legal theory. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for today's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The second panel of witnesses is now dismissed. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for a closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now that we understand the litigation efforts by President Trump and his allies, I'd like to present additional actions taken by the Trump campaign during this time. President Trump continued to push the stolen election narrative, even though he and his allies knew that their litigation efforts making the same claim had failed. It's worth pointing out that litigation generally does not continue past the safe harbor date of December 14th. But the fact that this litigation went on, well, that decision makes more sense when you consider the Trump campaign's fundraising tactics. Because if the litigation had stopped on December 14th, there would have been no fight to defend the election and no clear path to continue to raise millions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd ask for unanimous consent to include in the record a video presentation describing how President Trump used the lies he told to raise millions of dollars from the American people. These fundraising schemes were also part of the effort to disseminate the false claims of election fraud.
Without objection, so.
My name is Amanda Wick, and I'm Senior Investigative Counsel with the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Between Election Day and January 6th, the Trump campaign sent millions of fundraising emails to Trump supporters, sometimes as many as 25 a day. The emails claimed the, quote, left-wing mob was undermining the election, implored supporters to, quote, step up to protect the integrity of the election, and encouraged them to, quote, fight back. But as the Select Committee has demonstrated, the Trump campaign knew these claims of voter fraud were false, yet they continued to barrage small-dollar donors with emails, encouraging them to donate to something called the Official Election Defense Fund. The Select Committee discovered no such fund existed.
I don't believe there is actually a fund called the Election Defense Fund. Is it fair to say that the election defense fund was another, I think we called it a marketing tactic?
Yes.
And tell us about these funds as marketing tactics.
Just a topic matter where money could potentially how money could potentially be used.
The claims that the election was stolen were so successful, President Trump and his allies raised $250 million, nearly $100 million in the first week after the election. On November 9th, 2020, President Trump created a separate entity called the Save America PAC. Most of the money raised went to this newly created PAC, not to election-related litigation. The Select Committee discovered that the Save America PAC made millions of dollars of contributions to pro-Trump organizations, including $1 million to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' charitable foundation, $1 million to the America First Policy Institute, a conservative organization which employs several former Trump administration officials, $204,857 to the Trump Hotel Collection, and over $5 million to Event Strategies, Inc., the company that ran President Trump's January 6th rally on the Ellipse.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
The evidence developed by the Select Committee highlights how the Trump campaign aggressively pushed false election claims to fundraise, telling supporters it would be used to fight voter fraud that did not exist. The emails continued through January 6th, even as President Trump spoke on the Ellipse. 30 minutes after the last fundraising email was sent, the Capitol was breached.
Every American is entitled and encouraged to participate in our electoral process. Political fundraising is part of that. Small dollar donors use scarce disposable income to support candidates and causes of their choosing, to make their voices heard. And those donors deserve the truth about what those funds will be used for. Throughout the committee's investigation, we found evidence that the Trump campaign and its surrogates misled donors as to where their funds would go and what they would be used for. So not only was there the big lie, there was the big ripoff. Donors deserve to know where their funds are really going. They deserve better than what President Trump and his team did. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank all of our witnesses today, and I'd also like to, in particular, wish Mr. Stepien and his family all the best on the arrival of a new baby. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, was very narrowly focused, and in the coming days, you will see the committee move on to President Trump's broader planning for January 6th, including his plan to corrupt the Department of Justice and his detailed planning with lawyer John Eastman to pressure the Vice President, state legislatures, state officials, and others to overturn the election. Let me leave you today with one clip to preview what you will see in one of our hearings to come. This is the testimony of White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. John Eastman called Mr. Hirschman the day after January 6th, and here is how that conversation went.
I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
At the conclusion of last week's hearing, we showed you a video of rioters explaining why they had come to Washington on January 6th. It was because Donald Trump told them to be here. Today we heard about some of the lies Donald Trump embraced and amplified when it became clear he didn't have the numbers of votes to win the election. We heard about how officials at different levels of government explored claims of fraud and found no evidence Yet the former president continued to repeat those false claims over and over again. Today, we'll end things where we did on Thursday, back on January 6th, hearing words of individuals who wanted to stop the transfer of power. We know they were there because of Donald Trump. Now we hear some of the things they believed. Without objection, I enter into the record a video presentation.
I know exactly what's going on right now. Fake election. They think they're going to fucking cheat us out of our vote and put Congress fucking Biden in office. It ain't fucking happening today, buddy. You voted?
Yes, sir.
How'd it go?
Voted early. It went well, except for can't really trust the software. Dominion software all over it.
We voted, and right in the top right-hand corner of the Dominion voting machine that we used, there was a Wi-Fi symbol with 5 bars. So that most definitely connected to the internet, without a doubt. So they stole that from us twice. We're not doing it anymore. We're not taking it anymore. So we're standing up. We're here. And whatever happens, we're not laying down again.
It didn't work. It absolutely worked. It didn't work. No. Trust the system. 200,000 people that weren't even registered voted. 430,000 votes disappeared from President Trump's tally. And you can't stand there and tell me that it worked.
I don't want to say that what we're doing is right. But if the election's being stolen, what is it going to take?
The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
And thus concludes the first of what will be 3 hearings this week in the series of landmark and historic hearings on Capitol Hill, nearly a year-long investigation with so many documents poured over and interviews. And today the case, in the words of Zoe Lofgren just wrapping up, that this was a coup in search of a legal theory. And yet the President of the United States was told over and over again by all the president's men, people he had appointed, people that were part of his campaign, that there were no legitimate claims of campaign or voter fraud. Let's bring in our chief election and campaign correspondent, Robert Costa. And Bob, how much of this is about building essentially the case of a conspiracy?
Just a few days ago, the vice chair, Congresswoman Cheney, sat down with CBS News, and she said the committee would outline a conspiracy. Now we are seeing that case being made in vivid detail, and it brings back that phrase from Watergate, all the president's men, people we haven't heard from before. Campaign lawyer Matt Morgan, campaign and White House lawyer Eric Hirschman, telling a story about how then President Trump embraced a lie, and they ended today by saying that soon to come will be the story of John Eastman, that conservative lawyer who provided Trump with a plan to overturn the election.
Bob Costa on the Hill for us. Thank you. Let's bring in Catherine Herridge now. And Catherine, I know you have been following this investigation. We heard from several members of this committee that they believe that they have compiled enough evidence for the Justice Department to consider a criminal indictment against former President Trump. What are you learning?
Well, Nora, it's a very high bar. I think what's come to the fore in the hearing today is that any investigation will succeed or fail based on the strength and the credibility of the timeline. And congressional investigators have begun this process of laying out a very detailed timeline, beginning on the night of the election itself. According to then Attorney General Bill Barr, that President Trump was already talking about these claims of election fraud. And within days, his then White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, and his son-in-law, son-in-law, Jared Kushner, had told colleagues that the president, Trump, knew to go not too far and that they felt that he could rein in these claims of President Trump. But what's key here is early December. The Attorney General, as well as the acting Deputy Attorney General, said that they had told President Trump repeatedly that they had looked into the fraud and the allegations and they had found no there. And just bear with me, because December is so important to the most serious charges for January 6th of seditious conspiracy. That involves two groups on the right, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And what we see in the indictments, the allegation, is that by mid-December, these groups were well advanced in their plans to block the certification of the Electoral College, and the allegation is that those plans were driven in large part by these claims of election fraud by President Trump. Nora.
Catherine Herridge, thank you so much. Let's bring back in Scott MacFarlane, who's covered this so closely. There's been more than 800 people who've been arrested and charged as a result of what happened on January 6th.
For a lot of the people charged in the Capitol siege, the big lie isn't just a piece of history. It remains current reality in their prosecutions. First of all, let me set the scene and show you just how many defendants we have at this point in time. More than 840 people charged. About a third of them have pleaded guilty so far. Fewer have been sentenced, but the Justice Department's been clear. They expect 200 to 300 more arrests, many of them accused of assaulting police. Some of these defendants, when they're in court, Nora, are still arguing the big lie. In fact, some of them are doing it to their own detriment. Let me show you one of the names and one of the faces. This is a man named Coy Griffin. He's a county commissioner from Otero County, New Mexico. He'll be sentenced on Friday. He was convicted earlier this spring. According to the prosecutors, he is still dug in that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. Nora, he is doing that ahead of sentencing at his own peril. He could get a stiffer sentence because of it.
Fascinating. Scott MacFarlane, thank you. Let's bring back in our CBS News cybersecurity expert and analyst, Chris Krebs. And Chris, you were interviewed by the committee. What kind of information were they seeking to learn from you?
Yes, that's right. I interviewed with the committee in December. Frankly, my information, I've been pretty transparent and forthcoming since my time in the administration. So I don't think I necessarily divulged anything new or noteworthy during that interview. Instead, it was laying the sequencing and the chronology of what we knew as in our election security efforts and in the types of information that we provided to the White House, including the Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, that I think the committee is working to use to establish that the Oval Office, the president and his campaign staff knew exactly what was going on out there in the states, that there was no interference, and yet they proceeded with this conspiracy theory.
Chris Krebs, thank you. The other thing that I'm fascinated by, if I were someone who voted for President Trump, believed what the President of the United States told me, that there was this voter fraud, and I sent him money, because I believed that he had been wronged. $100 million raised in the first week, $250 million in total, and almost none of that money was used for campaign litigation. It went to line the pockets of some of the president's close friends and advisors. What's that? That's
so
got to anger people.
You would necessarily be upset about that. You might actually seek recourse. And one of the interesting things about the committee, it's not a prosecuting committee, but it can unveil and disclose evidence. It can also make a recommendation to the Justice Department. That recommendation has some weight, but not a lot. But there is something presented today that lets the Justice Department know there is plenty of evidence to look into to an ongoing fraud campaign. Mm-hmm. If these people who put out the emails knew, and there's an evidentiary trail that substantiates they knew the claims they were making in these fundraising appeals were false, they are participating in an intentional deception of Trump campaign or Trump supporters and taking money out of their pockets and putting it in theirs.
And to pick up on what Major said, given the tower of evidence today that came from inside the House, they can't possibly have not known. In other words, there was so much evidence you can't base a claim on the idea that the election was stolen. But to your question, Nora, that people might feel ripped off, there are a lot of people with apocalyptic thinking out there, and a lot of politicians who sell apocalyptic apocalyptic thinking. And they say basically things are so dire, all bets are off. So with that mindset, what President Trump was doing was just everything he possibly could to fight the apocalypse of the left. With that mindset, that's why these hearings are so vital, because lawmakers stood by and watched. They knew the election wasn't stolen. They did nothing. Now there's all this evidence. Somebody needs to stand up and say rules must be followed, because when they're not, anything goes. And you can't have a government founded on the idea that anything goes.
Stand by. Let's listen in to Congresswoman Lofgren, who is just outside the committee room.
Within the whole time, 2.5 hours of testimony. And, I don't think he particularly wanted to sit here, to be honest, and we didn't think we needed to, because we had all of his testimony from the interview, and it was sufficient.
What about the significance of that? A large part of the presentation was Attorney General Barr laying out not so many terms like Trump didn't believe anything he had to say.
Well, I think the importance is that the Attorney General and other people investigated all of these allegations, and they weren't true. And they directly told the president over and over again they were false. These were his people. This was Trump world telling the president that what he was saying was false. And he continued to say it.
And he's the chief law enforcement official for the country, appointed by former President Trump. If you can't believe the person you put in charge of all the law enforcement in the country, who can you believe?
Well, it is not just a matter of belief. I think, as the Attorney General Cliff said in the first hearing, belief that is untethered from any evidence is not of value. The evidence did not support what he was saying, and he continued to say it again.
Mr. Chairman, given the scanning information and fundraising, can we expect to see any more information about the RNC fundraising beyond just the Trump campaign?
And of course, we have a lot of evidence, and if we laid out all of the evidence of every subject, we'd be here for a long, long time.
Yeah,
so
look at the report.
Some
of it we put in the final report. I think what you saw here was just a sampling of a mountain of evidence on a lot of things that we have. But we only have about an hour and a half to 2 hours to present.
What difference would it have made if Bill Stepien would have been here?
All right, just some final thoughts from the chairman there and Congresswoman Lofgren, who, by the way, happened to be a staffer during the Watergate committee hearings, was also, you may recall, was part of the impeachment hearings, so has a long history of investigating presidents in Congress, well regarded by both parties. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes. And Nancy, what are you hearing from White House officials about what we're hearing today?
Well, Nora, they've made it pretty clear that they are not going to be reacting to every twist and turn in this set of hearings. The president himself did speak on Friday briefly. He said that these hearings are exposing the assault on democracy that was led by the former president of the United States. And typically, this would be a pretty potent midterm election message that this White House would be pushing all the time, arguing to voters, don't reelect Republicans, don't give them the majority in the House or the Senate because they stood by while President Trump pushed these false claims. However, the very same day that President Biden was making that argument, we also got a new inflation report that showed that inflation was even a little worse than economists had expected. And so that has really blunted the White House's ability to push forward this message, because what they've determined is that they really need to be showing the American people that they are focused on the economy and inflation 24/7.
Nancy Cordes, thank you. Of course, that's the other big headline we're following today. The Dow slipping 600 points to start this week, and S&P falling back into bear market territory. Nicole Killian, we're going to have 2 more hearings this week, right? What will we see?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think you saw a lot of emphasis put on Bill Barr's testimony, and I think you will see the committee continue to build on that by allowing other former Justice Department officials to testify starting Wednesday about the former president's efforts to pressure the Justice Department on how to overturn the election.
Just when it seems that they've already presented so much evidence, there is more to come from all of these depositions and their nearly year-long investigation. Thank you all very, very much. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and we'll have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington.
he sees it as me being guilty.
Do you know what